The story begins far from the marble halls of Washington, far from the echoing chambers of the Capitol. It begins in the red clay dust of Pike County, Alabama, a land of gentle slopes and endless cotton fields that shimmer white under the late summer sun. The year was 1940, and deep in the rural South, time moved at the pace of a mule-drawn plow. A small wooden house stood among pecan trees, its tin roof catching the early morning light. The air smelled of turned earth and wild honeysuckle, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bobwhite quail. This was the world that shaped John Robert Lewis, a boy whose voice was soft, but whose spirit already held the quiet strength of the soil that nurtured him. John was one of 10 children, born to sharecroppers Eddie and Willie Mae Lewis. Life on the farm followed the rhythm of the seasons, planting, chopping cotton, picking, and the brief rest of winter. As a small boy, John found his first congregation not in a church, but in the dusty yard behind the house. There, among the scratching hens and the proud rooster with his rainbow plume, he would gather the chickens around him. He talked to them softly, read to them from the family Bible, and practiced the hymns he heard on Sunday morning. The chickens bobbed their heads and murmured back, and in that simple exchange, a future leader discovered the power of a calm, persistent voice. The Lewis family's home was a place of quiet order. The unpainted walls held the warmth of the day long after sunset, and the kerosene lamps cast a soft amber glow over the worn floorboards. In the evenings, the children would sit on the porch and watch the stars appear one by one above the tree line. John's mother moved through the house with a gentle humming, her hands never still. She taught him by example that dignity was not something a person had to earn, it was something no one could take away. His father, a man of few words, showed him that every honest day of labor left its own kind of blessing on the land. But even in this peaceful enclave, the wider world pressed in. The boy walked miles to a one-room schoolhouse, a journey that took him past fields of cotton where men and women bent low under the weight of the sun. He noticed the differences, the school bus that carried white children to a brick building with real desks, while his own school had hand-me-down books and a pot-bellied stove for heat. John did not grow angry. He grew curious. He began to wonder why the world was arranged in such a way, and whether a gentle voice could ever be loud enough to rearrange it. On Sundays, the family put on their best clothes and walked to the little country church. The building was a simple white wooden box under a tall steeple, surrounded by ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss. Inside, the air grew thick with the scent of pine wood and perfume, and the voices of the congregation rose and fell like the tide. Young John watched the preacher, an old man with a face like worn leather, lift his hands and speak of a promised land where there was no sorrow. The boy felt something stir in his chest, a calling that he could not yet name. He would come home and preach to his chickens with even more earnestness, baptizing the new chicks with a gentle dip into the water trough, never harming a feather. As the years passed, John's heart reached beyond the farm. A cousin gave him a nickname, Preacher, and it stuck. He saved his pennies to buy a small radio, and late at night, with the volume turned low so as not to wake the sleeping house, he pressed his ear to the speaker. A voice came through the static, a smooth, measured voice from faraway Atlanta, the voice of a man named Martin Luther King Jr. The sermon spoke of love and justice, of turning the other cheek and resisting hate with peace. John sat in the dark, the cool night air slipping through the window screen, and felt as if the words had been written just for him. The first chapter of his life closed with a decision. He was a young man now, but still the same boy who had preached to chickens under the Alabama sun. He decided to leave the farm, to seek an education, to find a way to make his voice heard. The morning he left, the dust road stretched out before him like an unread page. The pecan trees rustled a farewell, and the old rooster crowed once, as if offering a benediction. John Robert Lewis walked away from the only home he had ever known, carrying nothing but a small bag and a heart full of purpose. The road ahead would be long, but he was already accustomed to walking. The road from Pike County led John Lewis north to Nashville, Tennessee, a city of church steeples and learning, where the Cumberland River wound lazily through green hills. He arrived at the American Baptist Theological Seminary, a campus of red brick buildings shaded by old maples, and he carried with him the quiet confidence of the rural South. The city moved faster than the farm, but John remained unhurried, walking to class with a measured stride, his eyes taking in every detail of this new world. In Nashville, he would learn not only theology, but a new kind of sermon, one written not in words alone, but in the movement of bodies through space, in the peaceful occupation of a lunch counter stool. But before the sit-ins, there were the workshops. In the basement of Clark Memorial Methodist Church, John sat in a circle with other young students. The room smelled of old hymnals and floor wax, and the light came through high windows in soft, dusty shafts. Here, a gentle-spoken teacher named Jim Lawson introduced them to the philosophy of nonviolence. He spoke of Gandhi and Thoreau, of the soul force that could transform a society without ever raising a fist. John listened with his whole body leaning forward, his hands resting on his knees. He understood, from his earliest days on the farm, that gentleness was not weakness. Now he was being given a language for what his heart already knew. They practiced. Over and over, they staged mock sit-ins. Some students played the role of angry white patrons, hurling insults and shoving. The others practiced receiving the insult without flinching, looking the aggressor in the eye with calm respect, refusing to respond to hate with hate. John discovered that his breathing could slow, that he could find a still place inside himself even as the storm raged around him. The training sessions were long and exhausting, but they were also joyful. The young people laughed between drills, shared sandwiches, and sang freedom songs that echoed off the basement walls like a promise. Nashville itself became a classroom. John would walk through the downtown streets, past the grand Art Deco buildings and the department stores with their polished windows. He observed the world he was determined to change, the lunch counters where Black citizens could buy food but never sit, the movie theaters with their separate entrances, the public restrooms signed with words meant to divide. He did not look with anger. He looked with the steady gaze of a man who was already building a different city in his mind, a city where the doors would swing open for everyone, where the light would fall equally on all faces. In his seminary room, a simple cell with a narrow bed and a wooden desk, John kept a stack of books beside his lamp. He read Augustine and Niebuhr, and he wrote letters home, describing the new ideas in careful, hopeful language. The window looked out onto a small courtyard where squirrels chased each other around the trunk of a sycamore tree. In the mornings, he could hear the bells of nearby churches tolling the hours. The quiet of that room was his sanctuary, the place where he gathered his thoughts before stepping out once more into the stream of history. Then came the day they were ready. The first real sit-in was a quiet revolution. John dressed in a suit, polished his shoes until they reflected the light, and walked with a handful of friends into a Woolworth's on Fifth Avenue. They sat down at the lunch counter and asked to be served. The waitress ignored them. The other customers shuffled away. John folded his hands on the countertop and breathed deeply. The moments stretched into hours. Outside, the afternoon sun crossed the sky and painted the storefronts in gold. Inside, the stillness held. It was not a moment of conquest. It was a moment of witness, a small candle flickering in a great darkness. The sit-ins continued day after day. Each morning, John and his fellow students would gather for prayer before walking downtown. The light of those early Nashville mornings was soft and hopeful, the streets empty except for the milk trucks and the sound of sparrows. They walked with their hearts beating slow and strong, the way a long-distance runner learns to pace himself. The city watched. Some jeered, others simply paused on the sidewalk, curious. John never raised his voice. He learned that silence could be a kind of speech, that a calm refusal could shake the foundations of an unjust order more effectively than any shout. At night, when the day's discipline was done, John would return to the seminary, his body tired but his spirit strangely renewed. The sycamore tree in the courtyard would be full of shadows, and the stars would emerge clear and sharp. He would sit on the steps and listen to the city settling into sleep, the distant murmur of traffic, the cry of a night bird. He felt then that he was a part of something far larger than himself, a river of change that had been flowing long before he was born and would flow long after. In that quiet darkness, the preacher's call was being answered, not in a church, but in the streets, one peaceful step at a time. The philosophy that guided John Lewis was not a political ideology, it was a way of loving. In the quiet classrooms and chapel spaces of his early training, he absorbed the idea that nonviolence was not merely a tactic but a way of life. He studied the Sermon on the Mount and the story of the Good Samaritan until the words became part of his breathing. He read about Gandhi's salt march to the sea, imagining the long line of walkers against the Indian horizon, the white cotton robes, the bare feet in the dust. John began to see that his own path would be a path of walking, of moving his body through space as an act of prayer. This chapter of his story was the slow schooling of the heart, the careful cultivation of a love so strong it could absorb hatred and return it transformed. Deep in the library stacks, John discovered the writings of Howard Thurman, a theologian who spoke of the religion of Jesus with a mystical tenderness. Thurman's words were like cool water on his soul. He wrote about the inner disciplines, silence, meditation, the centering of the self before confronting injustice. John began to practice these disciplines daily, waking before dawn to sit in the stillness of his small room. He would close his eyes and picture a circle of light surrounding him, a protective presence that nothing could penetrate. This was not a retreat from the world, but a preparation for it, a gathering of the spirit before the long day's offering. The young man from Alabama also learned to sing. The freedom songs were not performance, they were breathing exercises for the movement, ways to synchronize the hearts of many into one steady rhythm. In the churches of Nashville, John would stand shoulder to shoulder with his brothers and sisters, their voices rising softly at first, "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine," then building into a gentle thunder. The wooden pews vibrated, the stained glass windows caught the morning sun, and the singers swayed without plan, moved by the same invisible current. In those moments, John glimpsed the beloved community, a society where all people sat down at the table together, not as strangers, but as family. But love required testing. The news from Montgomery, the news from Birmingham, spoke of fire hoses and police dogs turned upon children. John heard these reports not in anger, but in sorrow, a sorrow that drove him to his knees. He understood that those who wielded the hoses were themselves wounded souls, trapped in a system that deformed both oppressed and oppressor. This was the hardest lesson, to love the enemy not in the abstract, but in the flesh, to see the divine spark even in the face contorted with hate. John practiced this in his mind, picturing the confrontations to come and rehearsing his own response, a steady look, a quiet word, refusal to become the mirror image of the hostility aimed at him. In the spring of 1961, John became a freedom rider, boarding interstate buses to challenge segregation in the deepest parts of the South. But his experience was not the violent clash that headlines would report, it was the quiet moments in between that he treasured. The hours spent staring out the window at the passing landscape, the pine forests of South Carolina, the sleepy cotton towns of Georgia, the reddish fields of Alabama stretching to the horizon under a vast blue sky. The hum of the tires on asphalt was a steady lullaby, and inside the bus, the riders shared peanuts and conversation, their faces lit by the shifting patterns of sun through the windows. It was a traveling sanctuary, moving through the countryside like a ship through calm seas. At rest stops, the riders would step out into the warm air and stretch their legs. Gas station attendants watched them with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, but John would greet them with a soft, "Good morning," his eyes meeting theirs with an unshatterable dignity. He learned that a simple greeting could be a radical act, a refusal of the whole architecture of separation. The small country stores, with their screen doors and wooden benches, became way stations on the road to the beloved community. The Coca-Cola cooler hummed, a ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, the light came through dusty windows. In these ordinary spaces, the revolution was being rehearsed, one gentle word at a time. But the road grew harder. Buses were met by mobs, riders were pulled from their seats and beaten. John himself knelt in prayer while blows fell upon his head. Yet even these moments, in his memory, were surrounded by a strange quiet, the hush before the storm, the stillness of his own heartbeat drowning out the noise. He described the sensation as a kind of detachment, as if his body were there, but his soul was cradled in a safer place. The lesson of love was being tested to its breaking point, and it did not break. Each blow only pressed the love deeper into his bones, until it became as solid as the Alabama clay of his childhood. When he returned to Nashville to recover, the city welcomed him with open arms and soft voices. He sat in the familiar basement of Clark Memorial Methodist Church, now worn but sacred, and he shared his testimony with the new recruits. He told them that the path of nonviolence was not a sprint, but a long, slow walk through the valley. He told them that every insult absorbed was a seed planted, that every act of sacrificial love was a brick in the foundation of a new world. He spoke without theatrics, his voice steady and low, and the silence in the room was deeper than any applause. The lesson of love was not something he had mastered, it was something he was still learning, every day, with every breath. The Alabama River flows through Selma like a ribbon of dark glass, slow and unhurried, reflecting the sky with barely a ripple. In the early months of 1965, the city of Selma became the focal point of a great moral struggle, the right to vote. But for John Lewis, Selma was first and foremost a landscape, a place of tree-lined streets and antebellum houses with wide porches, of azalea bushes bursting into color as spring approached. He arrived there with the calm resolve of a pilgrim who had traveled many roads. The work was quiet at first, meeting in church basements, filling out paperwork, teaching sharecroppers and domestic workers how to pass the literacy tests that had been designed to fail them. The real movement happened not in grand gestures, but in the patient accumulation of small, faithful acts. Brown Chapel AME Church became the headquarters, a red brick building with a tall steeple that seemed to pierce the morning fog. Inside, the wooden pews curved around the pulpit like embracing arms. John spent hours there, resting between planning sessions, listening to the murmur of organizers and the occasional burst of song. Light poured through the stained glass windows in colors of ruby and gold, painting the congregation in soft, dappled hues. The air smelled of old wood and floor wax and the faint sweetness of perfume from the women who came straight from their jobs to attend the mass meetings. It was a sanctuary in the truest sense, a place where the weary could find rest before the next stage of the journey. The plan was to march from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery, a distance of 54 miles, to demand voting rights. On the morning of March 7, 1965, the morning that would later be called Bloody Sunday, John Lewis woke before dawn. The sky outside his window was a deep indigo, fading to pearl at the horizon. He dressed slowly, carefully, putting on a tan raincoat and a small backpack that contained an apple, a toothbrush, a book of scripture. He did not know what the day would hold, but he walked to Brown Chapel with the same measured step he had learned on the farm, feeling the cool morning air on his face and listening to the first birds begin to stir. The city was still asleep, its streets empty and silent, as if holding its breath. At the church, the marchers gathered. They were men and women, young and old, dressed in their Sunday best, suits and ties, clean dresses, sturdy shoes. They lined up in pairs, and John took his place at the front alongside Hosea Williams. There was no loud chanting, no drum beating. Instead, there was a hush, a collective inhale before the first step. From the top of the church steps, the view stretched down the street toward the Edmund Pettus Bridge, an arch of steel and concrete spanning the river. In the early light, the bridge looked almost gentle, its metal beams glowing with a faint orange tint. It was just a bridge, a passage from one side to the other, and yet it was a threshold between two worlds. They began to walk. The procession moved slowly, the sound of footsteps on pavement a soft, shuffling rhythm. John could hear the breathing of the people around him, the rustle of coats, the distant cry of a gull over the water. As they approached the bridge, the Alabama River came into view below, wide and placid, its surface catching the morning light like a sheet of polished silver. The trees along the bank were still bare from winter, their branches sketched delicately against the sky. For a few suspended seconds, the marchers were suspended between earth and water, and John felt a profound peace. It was a moment of perfect stillness, the kind that falls before the dawn fully breaks. What happened next has been recorded in history books, but the details are not necessary for a quiet retelling. Suffice it to say that on the far side of the bridge, the marchers encountered a line of state troopers who ordered them to disperse. There was a pause, a long moment of prayer, and then a response that came not in words, but in an overwhelming force. What matters for our story is not the violence, but the way John Lewis carried himself in the aftermath, the way he returned to Brown Chapel that evening with a bandage around his head, his voice still steady, his eyes still clear. The day had not broken his spirit, it had polished it, the way the river polishes a stone. In the days that followed, the nation watched. Citizens from across the country streamed into Selma to join the cause. The churches overflowed, the streets filled with the music of hope. John spent long hours sitting on the steps of Brown Chapel, now a legend in his quiet coat, greeting those who came with a gentle handshake. He often walked back to the bridge alone at dusk, standing at the midpoint and looking down at the water. The sunset turned the river into a ribbon of fire, then purple, then black. He thought of the chickens of his childhood, the stillness of his seminary room, the long bus rides through the southern night. All of it had led to this bridge, this river, this quiet communion with the fading light. Eventually, the march would continue legally, peacefully, with the protection of federal order. And John Lewis would walk the entire 54 miles to Montgomery, step by step, through rain and shine, past fields of wildflowers and under the canopy of stars. But the moment that stayed with him most was that first approach to the bridge at dawn, when the world was new and anything seemed possible. He learned on that bridge that the most powerful revolutions are often silent, a man in a tan coat walking forward, his heart beating slow and strong, his eyes fixed on a horizon he could almost see. When the march from Selma to Montgomery at last received federal protection, it became a pilgrimage. John Lewis would walk the whole 54 miles, a distance he had once trudged behind a mule, but now walked with a new sense of purpose. The caravan set out in the late morning of March 21, 1965, the air cool and clean, the sky a vast dome of pale blue. Thousands had come from every corner of the country, ministers and students, housewives and laborers, all walking together. John moved through the crowd like a shepherd among his flock, offering a quiet word here, a hand on a shoulder there. The road stretched ahead, a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through the green fields of Lowndes County, and the marchers stepped out to meet it. The rhythm of the walk was its own kind of meditation. Left foot, right foot, a steady cadence that synchronized the breath and settled the mind. The countryside unfolded at a walking pace, revealing its secrets gradually. Fields of clover bloomed pale purple near the roadside. Black Angus cattle stood motionless under groves of live oaks. Old barns leaned into the earth, their silver gray wood weathered by decades of rain and sun. The walkers passed white clapboard churches with tiny cemeteries, their grave markers tilted at gentle angles. John noticed everything, cataloging the beauty of the land as if preparing to write a letter home. He had always believed that the struggle for justice was also a struggle for the right to appreciate beauty without condition. As evening fell on the first night, the marchers made camp in a wide meadow just off the highway. Tents were pitched, fires lit, and the smell of cooking beans and cornbread rose into the fading light. John sat on a fold-out stool near the fire, his tired feet stretched before him, and accepted a tin cup of coffee. The voices around him were low and melodic, the conversation drifting from the day's events to old family stories. Someone produced a harmonica and began to play "We Shall Overcome," the notes thin and reedy, floating over the meadow like an offering. Stars emerged one by one, then in great clusters, the Milky Way spreading across the blackness like a spill of spilled milk. It was a night of rare peace, a pause in the long journey. The walk continued through rain and shine. One afternoon, a cool drizzle began to fall, Not a downpour, but a gentle, persistent mist that clung to everything. The marchers pulled on ponchos and kept going, their footsteps leaving impressions in the softened earth. The rain transformed the landscape into a watercolor painting, the green hills dissolving into silver fog, the asphalt shining like a river, the distant tree lines blurred into soft smudges of gray. John walked with his head slightly bowed, letting the water bead on his cheeks. He thought of his mother, her hands in the wash basin, her quiet humming. The rain felt like a blessing, a washing of the road and of the spirit alike. Along the way, local families came out of their houses to offer water and food. They stood at the side of the road with pitchers of sweet tea and baskets of biscuits wrapped in checkered cloth. Their faces were a mixture of awe and simple kindness. John always made a point to stop and thank each one, pressing their hands and looking into their eyes. These brief encounters, the exchange of a glass of water, the shared smile of strangers, were the building blocks of the beloved community. He saw the whole march as a kind of living parable, a demonstration that people of different backgrounds could walk alongside each other, could break bread together under the open sky. On the outskirts of Montgomery, the landscape began to change. Fields gave way to houses, then to larger buildings. The Capitol dome became visible in the distance, a pale silhouette against the afternoon sun. But John's attention remained on the small things, a child waving from a porch railing, a dog barking a joyful greeting, a clothesline full of white sheets flapping in the breeze like doves. He had walked over 50 miles, and his body was exhausted, but his spirit felt light, almost buoyant. The finish line was not the Capitol steps. The finish line was every moment he had lived fully, every person he had touched with kindness along the way. On the final day, the crowd swelled to 25,000. They gathered on Dexter Avenue, a broad boulevard shaded by magnolia trees, and marched together to the steps of the Alabama State Capitol. But our story will not linger on the speeches or the politics. Instead, let us zoom in on a single moment. John Lewis, after the final prayer, stepping away from the crowd for a few minutes of solitude. He found a quiet spot under a camphor tree, its branches thick with glossy leaves, and he sat down on the cool grass. A sparrow hopped nearby, head tilting, then flew away. 54 miles behind him, a lifetime of gentle struggling, and still the same boy who preached to chickens. He allowed himself a small smile, the smile of a man who had walked a long way and knew there was still far to go, but who was, in this suspended instant, simply at rest. As sunset washed over Montgomery, the marchers dispersed, some boarding buses, others scattering to homes and churches. John lingered, watching the dome of the Capitol turn pink, then gray, then vanish against the darkening sky. The air was cooling, and the first street lamps flickered on along Dexter Avenue. He thought of the bridge in Selma, of the river still flowing beneath it, unchanged. The long walk beneath the stars was over, but the rhythm would stay in his bones forever, the slow, steady beat of feet on open road, carrying a dream forward, one peaceful step at a time. Years turned, and the road John Lewis walked eventually led him through the doors of the United States Capitol. In 1986, he was elected to Congress from Georgia's 5th District, a position he would hold for more than 3 decades. The morning of his first swearing-in, he arrived at the Longworth House Office building just as the sun was rising over the National Mall. The marble hallways were cool and silent, the high ceilings catching the first light in a soft, diffused glow. His office was a modest room with a wooden desk and a view of the Capitol dome. He placed on the desk a photograph of his parents, a worn copy of the Constitution, and a small ceramic chicken given to him by a constituent, a reminder, he said, of where he had come from and whom he served. Congressman Lewis quickly became known as the conscience of the Congress, but his daily life in Washington was marked by quiet routines. Each morning, he would walk from his apartment on Capitol Hill, often stopping at a small cafe for a cup of tea. He knew the street names, the flowering dogwoods that blossomed in spring, the old brick sidewalks with their gentle undulations. Constituents visiting the Capitol could often find him in the Rayburn cafeteria, sitting with a tray of oatmeal, reviewing briefing papers while a soft rain drizzled outside. He was accessible, unhurried, always willing to listen. His voice was so soft that reporters sometimes had to lean in, but his words carried the weight of history. His office became a museum of memory and hope. The walls were covered with photographs, Martin Luther King Jr. walking arm in arm with him, the marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, President Lyndon Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. A display case held a folded-up raincoat, the same one he had worn on Bloody Sunday. Visitors would pause before these artifacts, and John would often come out of his inner office to greet them. He would tell the story not as a hero's tale, but as a shared inheritance, reminder that ordinary people had done extraordinary things. "Keep the faith," he would say, pressing a campaign button into their hands. The room was never loud, never hurried. It was a sanctuary of stillness in a city of noise. His legislative work was not about dramatic speeches, but about steady, incremental progress. He focused on healthcare, on education, on the preservation of public lands. He loved the national parks, the wide, open spaces of Yosemite, the quiet trails of the Great Smoky Mountains, and he saw them as a common treasure, a place where every American could encounter the beauty and majesty of creation. He pushed for the preservation of civil rights sites, too, believing that the routes of the Freedom Riders and the steps of the Selma Bridge should be sacred spaces for prayer and reflection. His staff would find him late at night, sitting alone at his desk, writing letters to families who had lost loved ones, his pen moving in a slow, careful script. Once a year, John led a bipartisan pilgrimage to Selma. Members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, would board a bus in Washington and travel together through the Shenandoah Valley, across the rolling hills of Tennessee, into the quiet streets of Alabama. The journey was a living civics lesson. John would sit in the front seat, pointing out the window at landmarks, recounting stories in his gentle voice. When they reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the group would pause and stand in silence. The river below still flowed, the metal arch still stood. John would lead them across, his steps slower now, but still steady. The annual pilgrimage became a quiet ritual, a physical reminder that progress was not guaranteed. It had to be walked for, year after year. Outside of Washington, at his home in Atlanta, John Lewis was a neighbor, a friend, a lover of simple things. His house was a modest brick home on a tree-shaded street, with a front porch where he would sit on summer evenings. Children from the neighborhood would ride their bicycles past, and he would wave. He loved to read, especially histories and biographies, and he grew a small garden of tomatoes and peppers in the backyard. The former congressman was also known to feed the birds, scattering seed on the grass and watching the cardinals and mockingbirds with the same quiet attention he had once given his chickens. The cycle of gentleness, from the boy in the dusty Alabama yard to the elder statesman on his Atlanta porch, was complete. Age came gently. His hair turned gray, his steps slowed, but his eyes retained their soft clarity. In his final years, he could be found in the most peaceful places, the rotunda of the National Archives, studying the Declaration of Independence with a kind of reverence, the quiet garden at the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park, sitting on a bench under a magnolia tree, the gallery of Ebenezer Baptist Church, listening to the choir rehearse. He often said that he was still learning, still growing, still trying to become the person his chickens thought he was. The lesson of love that he had learned as a young man had become the melody of his entire life, a quiet song that never required a loud voice. On a warm July evening in 2020, John Lewis took his leave of this world. His family gathered around, and outside the windows of his home, the Atlanta sky softened into shades of lavender and rose. The nation mourned, but the mourning was threaded through with a deep, abiding sense of gratitude. His body lay in state at the Capitol, his flag-draped casket resting on the same catafalque built for Abraham Lincoln. But the image that lingered, for those who knew him best, was not the formal ceremony. It was the peaceful portrait of a man in a tan coat, crossing a bridge at dawn, walking toward a light that never dimmed. Now the story settles, like dust after a long walk, into the quiet of remembrance. If you visit Selma today, you will find the Edmund Pettus Bridge still arching over the Alabama River, its steel frame unchanged by the decades. In the early morning, fog rises from the water and clings to the metal trusses, and the bridge becomes a ghost of itself, half visible, half imagined. By noon, the sun burns off the mist, and the pedestrian path is busy with families walking dogs, couples strolling hand in hand, children on bicycles. The bridge is both a monument and a thoroughfare, a place where history lives alongside the everyday. And in the soft light of late afternoon, when the shadows grow long and the heat of the day begins to ease, the bridge has a way of whispering its story to those who are quiet enough to listen. The river below has watched it all. The Alabama River has seen cotton-laden barges of the antebellum South. It has reflected the torches of the Ku Klux Klan. It has carried in its slow current the hymns of enslaved people and the shouts of the newly free. The river is a being of deep time, patient and uncaring of human urgency. On the day the marchers crossed, it remained placid, giving no sign of the drama above. And on every day since, it has continued its slow pilgrimage to the Gulf, reflecting the same sky, the same clouds, the same stars. To stand at the railing and look down into the dark water is to feel the presence of all that has been, flowing away and yet always present. John Lewis used to return to this bridge often, not for ceremony, but for solitude. He would come alone or with a few close friends, usually at sunset. He liked to stand at the midpoint, the very spot where he had once bowed his head in prayer before the regiment of troopers. Now, instead of a solid wall of uniforms, he saw only the river and the sky and the distant tree line. He said the bridge was his sacred ground, a place that had taught him everything he needed to know about courage. For him, courage was not a loud, aggressive thing. Courage was a quiet voice at the end of the day saying, "I will try again tomorrow." It was the willingness to keep walking, step by step, through the valley of the shadow, toward a light that might be far away but was never invisible. Those who walked with him on these return visits noticed how his pace had slowed, how he would occasionally pause and close his eyes, as if listening to something only he could hear. They would see a faint smile cross his lips, a smile of reconciliation. In those moments, the old congressman became once more the young man in the tan coat, full of hope and unafraid. The years between vanished like morning mist. The bridge had that power to collapse time, to make all the different versions of John Lewis stand together on that span of steel and concrete, looking at the water, looking at the horizon, looking at one another with tenderness. One evening, not long before his passing, he came to the bridge one last time. The sky was a canvas of soft pastels, peach and rose and gold, and the river caught these colors and held them, trembling only slightly where a breeze touched the surface. A handful of tourists recognized him and kept a respectful distance, watching the gentle white-haired man lean on the railing. For a long time, he simply stood there, saying nothing. Then he turned and began to walk back across to the Selma side, his movement slow but deliberate, his silhouette dark against the dying light. It was the walk of a man who had crossed every bridge he had ever come to, and who knew this one would be his last. He was not sad, he was full, the way an ear of corn in late summer is full, ready for the harvest. Today, the bridge remains. And if you go there at sunset, you might imagine you see him. Not a ghost, but a presence, like the lingering heat on the asphalt after a long day. You might see the woman who brings fresh flowers to the midpoint every March, laying them gently beside a small plaque. You might see the school children who come on field trips, quiet for once, trying to understand what happened here. You might see the river continue its endless flow, and the horizon swallowing the sun, and the first stars appearing in the deepening blue. The story of John Lewis is not finished, because it is the story of a love that refuses to end, a gentle thunder that rolls on and on, a peace that passes all understanding. And so we close this quiet chronicle with an image, a bridge at dusk, a man in a tan coat standing at its center, leaning slightly forward, as if listening to the water below. Behind him, the lights of Selma are beginning to twinkle. Before him, the road to Montgomery stretches into the darkening east. He is not moving. He is resting at last, content in the golden afterglow. The air is cool and still. The only sound is the soft lap of water against the pilings and the distant song of a mockingbird. He has walked a long way, through fields and rain and history, and now he has come home. Sleep well, gentle warrior. The bridge is silent, and the river flows on, carrying your dream to the sea.